Well, so I think should start with a little tale that doesn't quite sound like a love story at first, but does end that way. I'm not really a love story teller, but I went through my repertoire and found a few out of the couple of hundred stories that I tell that I thought would really embody love. And wanted to start with a jack tale because you're in the South and you should honor that stuff. This one's actually from Wales, so, but it is a mountain story. So
South Wales.
South Wales, sure. um, the story's called Big Eyes. Once there was a witch, and she wanted to be a queen, and the only way she knew to be a queen was to marry a king. So she found a king. She said, "Marry me." He said no. So she found another king, and she asked him to marry her, and he also said no. And after she had asked 100 kings to marry her, and 100 kings had said no, she got mad. And then she got mean. Once there was a woman, an old woman who lived on the side of the mountain. She had 3 sons. You might have heard of them. The first son's name was William. The second son's name was Tom, and the youngest son's name was Jack. Well, the mom, she was sitting by the fire and she was thinking she really wanted to make some scones. But when she looked in the wood box, she realized there wasn't enough wood. And so she turned to her oldest son, "Billy, go out and get us some wood." He said, "Ma, it was a blizzard last night. There's way too much snow. I'm not going to find any firewood. I should just stay home." She said, "Billy, go out and get some firewood." Well, he wouldn't go, so you know what she does? She grabs him by the ear, pulls him over to the door, opens up the door, and throws him out. And it had been a blizzard. He lands in a snowbank. He's buried in a snowbank. By the time he gets out, he's so wet and cold, he just works his way back into the house next to the stove, and he doesn't move. Mother says, "What are we going to do about the firewood?" Well, Tom says, "Ma, I'll get you some firewood." Of course, he puts on big boots. He puts on his warm coat, he puts on his hat, and he heads off to the forest to get some firewood. But it had been a blizzard, and so he had to work really hard to make a path. Took him a long time. He finally gets out to the forest. Thank goodness when he got into the forest, most of the snow was up in the trees, so it was a little easier for him going into the forest. He went a little way and he came to a place he had been to plenty of times, but it was different now. See, there was a big clearing, and in the middle of that clearing, there was this tall watchtower. He'd never seen it before. He'd been here hundreds of times, and now there's a watchtower. He's thinking, where did this come from? And he walks around the watchtower looking for a door. He can't find one. So he walks around again looking for a window, and none. So he walks around one more time just to make sure, and up at the top of the tower, a set of shutters open up out of nowhere, and out pops the head of this little old man with eyes as big as your fist. And the little man calls down, "Hey, boy! Hey, boy! I'm stuck up here in this watchtower. I've been here a long time. I can't get out. I'm so thirsty. Do you think you could run up to the spring and get me a bucket of water?" Tom says, "No, I'm getting firewood for my mother." And he turns and he starts looking for firewood. Well, he sees a stick and he's about to pick it up when that stick just pops right out of the snow, spins around a couple of times and whacks him right on the head. Well, Tom's not having any of that. He turns and he starts running away, but that stick follows him. Whack, 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 all the way down the path. He runs so fast, he runs right out of his boots, he runs out of his coat, he runs out of his hat. By the time he gets home, he's so cold and wet. He sits down on the stove, by the stove next to William, and he doesn't move. Mother says, "Now what are we going to do about that firewood?" And little Jack stands up. "Ma, I'll get the firewood." William says, No, Jack, don't go out there. It's a blizzard." Jack says, I can do it." Tom says, No, Jack, don't go out there. You'll get beaten." Jack says, "I'm not afraid. And he puts on his boots, he puts on his coat, he puts on his hat, and he heads off. Now, let me tell you, it was really easy for Jack to walk up to the forest because his brother had already made the path. So it takes him right into the same place his brother had been, and he walks up and he sees this clearing where he's been tons of times, and now there's a clearing, and in the middle there's a watchtower, and he has to walk around it looking for a door. No door. He walks around it again looking for a window. No windows. Well, he walks around a third time just to make sure when up at the top of the tower, the shutters open out. Out pops the head of that little old man with eyes as big as your fists. And he says, hey boy, I've been trapped up in this tower a long time. I'm so thirsty. Do you think you can go to the spring and get me some water? Jack says, I don't have a bucket. Oh, there's a bucket at the spring. Okay. So Jack, he heads off. He wants to be nice. He goes on up to find the spring, except it had been a blizzard. Jack was a little guy, and even in the forest, it was hard for him to get up there. He's walking, he's clearing a path, He finally gets up to the spring, and it's frozen. And now Jack has to find something to break the ice, and luckily there was a bucket. So he takes the bucket, breaks that loose, smashes out the ice, gets a bucket of water, heads on down to the watchtower. The little old man lets down a string. Jack ties the bucket to it. He pulls it up. Thank you, boy. And shuts the shutters. Well, Jack starts gathering firewood. He finds a stick here, he finds a stick there, he puts them in a pile, and he's got a pretty good sized pile when he's thinking he's going to take his belt off and tie it around, make a bundle, put it on his back, and head for home. But as he's reaching for his belt, he gets that feeling. You know that feeling someone's looking at you? So he turns around. And when he does, he sees the watchtower's gone. And in its place is the little old man with the eyes as big as your fists. But he's wearing a beautiful robe. He's got a crown on his head. And he's got a wand in his hand. He says, Jack, I'm the king of the forest. Jack says, I can see that. Jack, you don't know, but some witch came up to me, asked me to marry her. When I said no, next thing you know, I find myself in that watchtower. I was stuck there. I couldn't get loose till someone did me a good deed. And Jack, that was you. I want to reward you. Jack says, oh, that's all right. I was glad to help. So no, Jack, I'm going to reward you. And he reaches onto his finger and he pulls off a ring, which he hands over to Jack. Jack takes the ring. He says, thank you. But when he looks up, the man was gone. So Jack slips the ring in his pocket, and then he goes to reach for his belt, but his belt just unties itself, drops down to the wood pile, bundles up the wood. Suddenly the whole wood pile lifts itself up all by itself and lands on his shoulder. It's as light as a feather. He brings it on home, and his mom made scones. That's not the end of the story. I know you kind of think it would be, but it's not. No, it's a Jack tale. So, of course, there has to be a king. And the king, he lived the rest of the way up the mountain. On the top of the mountain, he's got this fine castle and 3 daughters. They always have 3 daughters. Anyway, the king is sitting in his throne room with his 3 daughters amongst him, and into the throne room walks a witch. And she says, marry me! He says, no, you're a witch. She said, I said, marry me. He said, no, I'm not going to marry you. She said, you better marry me. This is your last chance. He said, I'm so glad. You can move along now. Well, she takes her staff and she smacks it down on the ground. And when she does, his treasury doors swing open. And out of his treasury comes all of his gold, all of his silver, all of his jewels, and they float right across, right through the throne room, right out the front door, across the drawbridge. The witch, she goes out there, stands in front of a boulder, lifts up her staff, and she slams it down. The boulder splits open, and all the gold and all the silver and all the jewels, they go right inside that boulder. They're inside the cave. And then she picks up her staff and she slams it down, and up comes this green flame. And she laughs a wicked laugh, you know. And gone. Well, the king, he says, well, that was something. Servants, go get my gold and my silver and my jewels. Well, they start walking over there. They get off the drawbridge. They're heading over for that big old boulder. But as they came close to that green flame, they stopped because it was hot. And they came on back to the king and said, Your Majesty, it's too hot for us. He said, never mind. And he calls his knights in shining armor, the bravest men in the kingdom. He calls them and he says, go get my gold and my silver and my jewels. And those knights in shining armor, they march up and they almost get to that green flame. When they stop, turn around and they walk back because it's getting a little hot in their little armor outfits. Well, the bravest one, the bravest knight of all, he marched right up to that green flame and melted. After that, nobody went near that green flame. The king, he sent out a proclamation, hear ye, whoever shall get my gold and my silver and my jewels will receive a third of the gold, a third of the silver, a third of the jewels, and one of my daughters. Lots of people would have liked that, but nobody went near that green flame. They'd all come and look at it, admire it, warm themselves at it, and then they would leave. Jack's brothers went up to look, Tom and William. Then they came home and told Jack about it. He said he wanted to go try. They laughed. Jack, you're just a little kid. That green flame's too hot for you. You better just stay away. But the next morning, Jack wakes up early. Everybody's still asleep. He doesn't want to stay in the bed with his two brothers, so he heads on downstairs and he's thinking, oh, Mom's not making breakfast yet. I might as well walk up to the castle and see the green flame, which is just what he does. Heads on up to the castle. He looks at the green flame, and it's pretty hot. He tries to get closer, and it's really hot. And Jackie just steps back, sticks his hand in his pocket, and he finds that ring that he got from the king of the forest, and slips it on his finger. And he rubs it a few times and he thinks, I wish that green flame was not so hot for me. And it wasn't. Jack walked right through that green flame, right into the cave in the boulder, right in. And then he saw all that gold and all that silver and all those jewels. He was like, whoa, how am I supposed to get all this out of here? Take me a year to carry it. So he rubs his finger, rubs the ring on his finger, and he says, I wish all this gold and silver and jewels would just pick itself up and head over to the king's door. And it did. The gold and the silver and the jewels, they just picked themselves up, walk right across, right through the green flame, right over the drawbridge, and set themselves down at the king's door. Jack figured he's done with what he came to do, so he turned around and headed for home. Now the king had just gone out in the balcony with his three daughters. They're going to have breakfast out there, and he sees the little boy running down the road. He goes, hey, who's that little raggedy muffin running away from the castle? Well, the oldest daughter, she looks, she says, I don't know, but he's wearing rags. And the second daughter, she looks down, she goes, oh, and he's dirty. But the third daughter, the youngest daughter, she looks down, she says, I don't know who it is, Daddy, but I think he's cute. Well, King didn't know about that, but he did know that somebody had been at his front door and he wanted to know what was up. So, of course, he sends his servants down. They open the door and what do they see? Why, all the gold, all the silver, all the jewels. They start screaming. They run up to the king. They tell the king, he says, go get that boy. And so they did. Meanwhile, Jack, he walks on down to his house. He looks at his house and he says, why do I live in a shack? And he takes that ring and he rubs it a few times. He says, I wish I lived in a castle, a big, beautiful castle, even bigger and more beautiful than the king's castle. And there it was. He's like, oh, and with a big kitchen for my mama to cook breakfast in my own bedroom. And then he walks inside. His mom comes running out of the kitchen. Jack, you wouldn't believe it. Scones galore. And his brothers come running down the stairs. Jack, we got our own bedrooms. And he was happy. Well, and he realized that he was kind of raggedy. And he says, why don't I have some nice clothes? And he rubs that ring on his finger. And he did. And right about the time They're knocking at the door. It's the servants. Well, they had been going down the road, and all of a sudden they see this castle that had never been there before, and they figured they better check. When they opened the door, there's Jack. They said, "Are you the little boy that was up at the castle?" He says, "Yes, I was." They said, "Wait right here." And they went back to the king. They told him how they found that castle down there. Brand new castle. Where'd it come from? They didn't know, but there was the boy. King says, "We better send our best carriage." And so they hooked up a beautiful golden carriage pulled by 6 beautiful horses. It was, the big golden pumpkin carriages. I think Cinderella borrowed it. And they sent it on down there for Jack and his mom and his 2 brothers. They bring them back up to the king. King says, "Jack, you did me a good favor. I was having a hard time making payroll without that gold and silver and jewels, Jack. A third of the gold, a third of the silver, and a third of the jewels is yours. And you can have one of my daughters to marry." Well, Jack, he says, Your Majesty, that's really nice of you. I don't need your gold, I don't need your silver, and I don't need your jewels. You just keep them. I got plenty of my own. And as for your daughters, he looks over at the oldest one, and he doesn't think too much of her. The middle one, he's just a little boy. He doesn't really think too much of her either. But when he looked at that youngest princess, he smiled. She smiled. He reached into his pocket, slipped that ring back on his finger. He said, "I wish that princess loved me." But for the first time, the ring didn't work. You know why? Because she already did. But that's the story of Big Eyes. I hope you enjoyed it. She already did. Yeah, love stories. So, talking about love, my parents were married for 68 years.
Wow.
68 years before my mom passed. My dad married her. He was just graduated from what would be high school. He went to Essex Aggie, which is an agricultural school instead of a high school. But it's basically the same thing. He got his high school diploma there, and met my mom at one of the dances at the end of the year. She had dropped out of high school, so that worked out really well for her. They got together. They got married. They had 10 kids. I'm number 7. Yeah. And they got old, of course, we all do. And they used to sit on the front porch in their rocking chairs, and as their memories faded, as you know, as we all know, memories fading. And both my father and my mother had real problems with their memory, but my mom forgot that she did. Yeah, she was always at my dad. "You gotta remember these things." One day she buys him a book, a notebook, and a little pen that fits into it. And she brings it home. He's sitting on the porch. She sits down and said, "I bought you a present." He says, "Oh, yeah?" She says, "Look, it's a book. You can write in." He says, "Oh, thanks." She says, "Yeah, if you need to remember something, you just write it down and you'll have it." He says, "Oh, thanks." And he set that book down, and never, ever, ever did he pick that thing up. It was still there the day he died. I swear, it was there. Meanwhile, one night they were sitting out on their rocking chairs out there on the porch, and my dad, he looks over at my mom. He says, "Honey, I'm feeling like ice cream. You want some?" She said, "Yeah, thank you. I'd love some ice cream." "Ice cream, yeah. Oh, honey, you gotta write that down." He says, I don't need to write it down. I can remember a thing, ice cream. I'll go get it." She said, "Yeah, but remember the other night we ground up them walnuts? I'd really like some walnuts on my ice cream." He said, oh, okay, I'll put some walnuts on your ice cream. I'll put it on mine too. It sounds like a good idea. Okay. She said, "Write it down." I don't need to write it down. I can remember 2 things, ice cream and walnuts. She said, "Yeah, but you remember we had the grandchildren over? They had that chocolate syrup. It's still in the refrigerator. He said, do you want chocolate syrup on your ice cream? She said, yes, please. He said, okay. She said, write it down. He said, I don't need to write it down. I can remember 3 things: ice cream, walnuts, and chocolate syrup. She said, yeah, but we still have some of that heavy cream, don't we? He says, you want me to make your whipped cream? She said, yes, please. He said, fine, I'll make up some whipped cream. She says, oh, good. Write that down. I don't need to write it down. I can remember. It's 4 things: ice cream, walnuts, chocolate syrup, and whipped cream. She says, you're not going to put a cherry on the top. He says, oh, right, cherry on the top. I'll be glad to do that. She said, write it down. He said, I don't need to write it down. I can remember 5 things: ice cream, walnuts, chocolate syrup, whipped cream, and a cherry on top. And he gets up and leaves the book right where it's been since she gave it to him. And he walks into the kitchen, and for the next half hour, she hears pots and pans clanking and banging, cabinet doors slamming. She has no idea what's going on at all. But finally, after that 30 minutes is up, he comes out with 2 plates. Scrambled eggs, bacon, home fries, and toast. And as he sets it down, she looks up at him. She goes, honey, I told you better write it down. You forgot to butter the toast. So I learned that story from Diane Cox over in Nebraska. She is a storyteller out there. I met her while I was traveling around in the 90s. For the next story I'd like to tell you, one of the stories that when I became a storyteller, I thought I really needed to do something to invest in that. And I found a class in the adult education program for librarians that taught storytelling. And I got to go to that class. They bought that actually. The teacher was like, oh no, the class is full. I said, classes are always full. There's a waiting list. I'll just be on the waiting list. She says, yes, but there's a lot of people on the waiting list. Your name is too low. I said, I'll be here on the first day of class and they won't be. Someone won't show up and I'll be in the class. She said, oh. So she didn't want to have a guy in her class back then. She wanted to have, she was concerned that the librarians would have be a little nervous telling stories with a guy. And but that's not how it worked out. It was a really wonderful class. She was a wonderful teacher. We became really good friends after that. But one of the assignments was a relatively long story, and I chose this story because, of course, I was working with all these women, so I picked a woman's story to tell, to learn, and it was called Tatterhood. Once there was a king, and he had a queen, but the queen was really unhappy, and the reason she was unhappy was because she had no child, no baby. She was miserable. She'd cry every night. I wish I had a baby. And the king tried very valiantly to get her a baby, but it did not seem to work year after year after year, till finally he said, my sister has 2 little girls. We'll just borrow one of them. And they did. They adopted this princess to come and live with them. And that made the queen happy enough. She no longer cried every night, but she still wanted a baby. Now, one of the things she did with the little girl that she had was get her a golden ball. A ball made of gold. And she gave it to her to play with. And this little girl would go out in the garden and she'd play catch with herself. And one day the queen looks out the window and what does she see? The princess playing with the golden ball, but she's tossing it over to a raggedy little beggar girl. And the queen, she did not think that was a good idea. She went storming down to the garden. She said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be in this garden. And the little beggar girl looks up at her. She looks straight her in the eye and she says, "You wouldn't say that to me if you knew who my mother was." "Well, who's your mother?" And the little girl says, "She's the hen wife in the marketplace." And the queen says, "So why would I care?" And the little girl says, "Because she knows how women can have children." And that got the queen's attention. And so she ordered the hen's wife to be brought from the market, and she brought her into the throne room, and she says, "Your daughter tells me you can help women have children." And the hen wife said, "Your Majesty should not be listening to raggedy little beggar girls." And so the queen sent her away and called that little girl back. She said, "Your mother did not tell me how to have children." And the little girl said, "Did you give her anything to drink?" The queen said, "What are you talking about?" "Give her a little bit to drink, and when it loosens her tongue, she'll tell you." So the queen brought the hen wife back and plied her with alcohol until she was pretty drunk. And then she said, "What about this helping women have children?" Well, now the hen wife answered. She says, "Oh, Your Majesty, I don't know if you want to know this. You might not want to do it, but if you go down to the spring under a full moon and you gather 2 buckets of water, bring them back to your room and you wash yourself with them, pour the buckets under the bed. In the morning, you'll see 2 flowers have grown. One will be beautiful. The other will be disgusting. Eat the beautiful one and leave the other one alone." Well, the queen wanted a baby, so she did just that. On the next full moon, she went out to the spring. She got 2 buckets of water. She brought them back to her room. She washed herself and she poured the buckets under her bed, went to sleep. And the next morning, there they were, the 2 flowers under the bed. One beautiful white flower, and the other was a strange green thing. Well, the queen, she broke off a little bit of that beautiful flower and she tasted it. And it was better than chocolate. It was incredibly delicious, and it didn't take her very long at all to eat the entire thing. And when she was done, she wished she had had more. And she looked over at that other flower and she broke off a little piece of it and she tasted it. It was even more delicious than the first. And the next thing you knew, she had eaten the whole thing. And she thought, well, it really can't hurt, can it? And 9 months later, she took to bed. Yes. And out pops this little baby riding on a goat, swinging a wooden spoon. And the baby looks up at her mom and says, "Hiya, mama!" The queen said, "Oh my God." The baby said, "Oh, don't worry, Mom. In a few minutes, you'll have another little girl. She'll be sweet and everything you want. Just perfect for you." And that was true. But just within 2 minutes, another baby was born. The twin. Well, not identical by any means, for this baby was beautiful. And they named her Elizabeth. And as she grew up, she grew more and more fair. They dressed her in the finest clothes. Her hair was beautiful yellow. They combed it every day. She was so perfect. She was the sweetest princess you had ever seen. And her sister, didn't matter what they put on her. Within a few minutes, it would be dirty and rags. And if she had a choice, she wouldn't even change her clothes. And so after a while, they didn't even bother changing her clothes. They just add new layers on top of the old rags. And she was dirty because nobody could get her into a bathtub. And most of the time, what she did was spend her time riding her goat around the castle, swinging that wooden spoon. The servants, especially the ladies in waiting, they couldn't deal with that. They were always trying to get her apart. But Elizabeth and Tatterhood, and that's what they called the first little girl, Tatterhood. They were best friends. They were inseparable. Well, if Tatterhood was riding around the castle on her goat, Elizabeth would be watching, and otherwise they'd be dancing together or whatever. But Elizabeth, she grew up to be the most beautiful girl, and Tatterhood just kept on growing up to be some kind of a weed. Well, one time they caught Tatterhood aside and they forced her into a tower and they locked her in. Tatterhood, she just jumps on her goat and she rides up the stone stairs. Got up to the top floor, rode right out the window and down the side of the tower. And then she's riding around the castle again, swinging that wooden spoon. And they gave up on her. But the children kept growing until they were young women. And then one day, their mother calls them, come quickly, come into the apartment. So they went into the queen's apartment and she shut the door and she locked it and she said, we have to stay in here. There's goblins. They've attacked the castle. Oh, the king and his soldiers, they're fighting them off, but we're going to stay here. We'll be safe. And Tatterhood said, no way. I want some of that fun. I'm going to go fight the goblins. Her mother said, no, Tatterhood, leave it to your father and his men. She said, I'm not leaving anything to anybody. I'm going to go out and fight those goblins. But you, Ma, you keep Elizabeth in here. And you guys stay safe. I'm going to go fight the goblins. And she unlocked the door and she rode off on her goat swinging her wooden spoon. The queen locked the door. And then her and the ladies in waiting climbed under the bed. Tatterhood was riding down the hallways. Every time she found a goblin, she'd pick up that spoon and whack him on the head. Whack, 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 whack. And the goat was kicking them. Those goblins, they were getting black and blue and bruised, and their lumps forming in their heads. Pretty soon, they looked like they had horns, and then they looked like they had spikes. And pretty soon, they were running out of that castle as quick as they could. And Tatterhood, she's riding around. Boom, boom, boom. Goblins screaming and yelling. But poor Elizabeth, down in the queen's apartment, all she can do is hear the screaming and yelling, and she doesn't know what's going on, and she's worried about her sister. And the queen and the ladies in waiting are all hiding under the bed, so she unlocked the door and took a peek out. But she can't see anything. So she opens the door a little more and she sticks her head out. Just as a goblin comes running down the pathway, well, he grabs Elizabeth's head, twists it off, and replaces it with a cow's head. Elizabeth stumbles backwards, lands on her fours, and starts moving around on the floor. The goblin takes the head and rides on off. Well, it took a little bit, but Tatterhood drove all those goblins out of the castle, and when she was done, she went back to the queen's apartment, and the door was ajar. And she opens it up, and there's Elizabeth walking around on her hands and knees, mooing like a cow. She calls her mother. You were supposed to watch her. Now I have to go to the Goblin Island and get her head back. Her mother says, no, Tatterhood, leave that for the king. He'll take care of it. Him and his men they'll go take care of that. Tatterhood says, no, I'll take care of it. And she went to see her father. She goes to her father and says, Dad, I need a ship. I'm going to go get Elizabeth's head back.
I need a ship.
And her dad said yes. He'd watched her drive the goblins out of the castle. Anything you want, sweetheart. And I'll give you my best soldiers to go with you. She says, oh, I don't need your soldiers. No, I just want the ship. I don't even want a crew. Just me. I can sail it. He said, okay. And she takes Elizabeth. And they get on the ship and they sail out into the ocean. Tatterhood sails the ship all by herself right across the ocean to the Goblins' Island. She pulls it around back so they won't see her. And then she tells Elizabeth, listen, stay below decks till I get back. But when you hear me calling, come on out and help me get this out of here. And then she hops on her goat, picks up a wooden spoon, and leaps over to the Goblins' Island. Doesn't take very long before she crosses the island, finds her way over to the Goblins' castle. She looks in the window. It's a big dining hall, and all the goblins are around this huge table. She looks across the hall And there on the wall is Elizabeth's head. Yeah, it's hanging there, and its face is frightful. Her eyes are popping out, and her mouth is in a big O. And Tatterhood, she just can't stand it. She spurs the goat, leaps right through the window, and then right down the banquet table. They're running right down the banquet table. All the goblins are looking up. Whoa, it's Tatterhood! She gets to the other side of the room, reaches up, grabs the head, spins around and heading back the other way. The goblins are trying to reach up and grab and take the head away from her, but every time they reach up, she just smacks their hands with the wooden spoon. Ah! Get her! All the goblins, they jump up, they run after her. She leaps out the window. They have to run around to the drawbridge, come out the other side. They're chasing after her, and she doesn't really go that fast. And the goblins start catching up with her, and as soon as they do, up goes that wooden spoon, and bang, bang, bang! And the goat is kicking them, too, too, too. Those goblins are moaning and groaning, and she takes off. They take off after her. 3 or 4 times they approached her, but by the time she got to the edge of the shore, they weren't so sure they wanted to fight anymore. So when her goat leaped onto the boat and she called for Elizabeth, they just sailed away. And she reached down, she pulled the cow's head off of Elizabeth's shoulder and dropped her own head on it. And she said, Elizabeth, we don't need to go home yet, do we? Let's go have an adventure. Tossed the cow's head into the water, and Elizabeth said, okay. So they sailed around and they saw the world in a way that princesses don't usually get to do. Tatterhood took her many, many places. And after they'd been sailing a while, they came to this island that had this huge cliff. At the top of the cliff, there was a castle, and at the bottom of the cliff, there was a dock. So Tatterhood pulled the boat up into the dock. And when she got it there, she said, Elizabeth, go down below and do not come up until I call you. So Elizabeth went down into the boat, into the holes of the boat, and Tatterhood got on the goat and started spinning that wooden spoon, and she's riding the goat around the deck of the boat. Well, the goat's hoofs are making this boom, 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 boom as it runs around the deck, and that sound is echoing up the cliff to the castle. It sounds like there's a drum circle or something down below, and the noise is just coming up, and the king says, what is that? Yeah, there was a king in the castle, of course, and he lived there with his brother. Their parents had passed, and the king and the brother, the king was ruling, and he looks down and he sees the boat down below. He doesn't recognize it. He turns to his servants, hey, go see who that is. Well, the servants, they have to ride their horses down this long set of stairs all the way down to the bottom of the cliff. They finally get down there, they go over to the dock, and there's Tatterhood still riding around the deck, swinging a wooden spoon. And they say, stop! But she ignores them. Just riding her goat, swinging a wooden spoon. They say, the king says stop! She ignores them. And eventually they get tired of waiting, and they go all the way back up the cliff. They go to the king. She won't stop. She's just a girl riding on a goat, swinging a wooden spoon. King says, brother, go down there and find out what's going on for me. So the prince, he rides his horse all the way down those stairs, all the way down to the dock. He pulls up. There's a Tatterhood still riding around, swinging a wooden spoon. He says, stop! And she does. And he looks at her. And he sees she's this young lady covered with dirt and wearing rags, and he riding a goat. He says, are you alone? She says, no, my sister's with me. She's down below. The prince says, well, could you bring her up so I can see her? She said, no. The king wants me to see her. And Tatterhood says, then the king can come down here himself. And she hops back on her goat and she rides off, swinging a wooden spoon, and nothing he could do would stop her. So he rides back up the cliff and he tells his brother, who says, okay, What else do you get to do when you live on an island, live in a castle on top of a cliff? So he gets on his horse, and with his brother, he rides all the way down the cliff until he comes to the dock. And as he pulls up to the dock, Tatterhood stops. The king looks up and he sees this young lady, dirty, raggedy, says, I heard you have a sister. And Tatterhood says, yes, I do. Elizabeth! And Elizabeth comes out. The king looks at her. Oh my goodness, she's so beautiful. His eyes practically pop out of his head. His jaw drops open. He's like, oh, would you marry me? Well, Elizabeth, she was touched too. Love at first sight. But she says, oh, I'm sorry. I'm the youngest sister. I can't get married before Tatterhood. The king looks over at his brother. The brother's horrified. And Tatterhood said, no, Elizabeth, if you want to get married, you go right ahead. I don't think you need to wait for me. And so the king takes Elizabeth and Tatterhood up to the castle, and they prepare for a wedding. Tatterhood and Elizabeth have their own room, and in this room they have these mannequins dressed in these beautiful dresses. Elizabeth showing it to Tatterhood says, look at the gifts he sent me. I'm going to wear this one for the wedding. You can pick any one of the other ones. Tatterhood says, I'm not wearing those. Elizabeth said, it's my wedding. Tatterhood says, well, if you want me to go to your wedding, then I can wear whatever I want. So Elizabeth let her. Wedding day comes. The king is dressed magnificently. He's on a beautiful white horse. Beside him is his bride. Oh, she's so gorgeous. And the diamonds are sparkling from her. They're riding up the road. All the people can't take their eyes off her until she's so far up the street. And then they look back and there's the king's brother. He's riding on a black horse. Oh, he's dressed so nice, and he did this gold and silver and gems in his reins, and beside him's riding Tatterhood on a goat, still all dirty, dressed in rags, carrying a wooden spoon. And the people are like, oh, at her sister's wedding? But so it was. And the prince, he's not even looking at her. He's not saying anything. He's just riding forward. When Tatterhood looks up and says, hey, Prince, how come you're not talking to me? He says, is there something to say? She said, well, you could ask me a question. Like what? You could ask why I ride on a goat. He says, why do you ride on a goat? She said, is it a goat? And he looks, and it's not a goat. It's a unicorn, a magnificent unicorn with iridescent shimmers of colors, everything beyond the rainbow, and a swirling, curling unicorn horn. And he doesn't know what else to say, so he says nothing. She says, aren't you going to ask me why I carry a spoon? He says, why are you carrying a spoon? She says, is it a spoon? And he looks, and it's an ivory wand, twisted with gold and silver braids and a gem on the top. Beautiful. And he doesn't know what to say. And she says, well, aren't you going to ask me why I'm wearing rags and all covered with dirt? And he says, nope. She says, why not? He says, because I already know. You're wearing rags. You're covered with dirt, obviously, because you want to be wearing rags and covered with dirt. Because if you didn't want to be, you wouldn't. And she smiled. And she wasn't. But whether she was beautiful or ugly, the story doesn't say. The prince fell in love with her, and she fell in love with him, and they got married along with the king and Elizabeth. A nice double wedding, perfect for a Valentine's Day. I suspect it was actually February 14th. Oh, I'm not done yet. Because, you know, after they finished their celebrations, they got into Tatterhood's boat and she took them over to meet her parents, who just adored both of the boys. And after they had a second ceremony and an additional celebration, the king and Elizabeth sailed back to his kingdom where they ruled. And Tatterhood and her groom stayed at her father's castle. And when her father and mother got old and retired, they left the throne to King Tatterhood. And that's the story of Tatterhood. It's absolutely worth learning of her story. It's a great tale. I love it.
Yeah.
So, back in the 90s, when the internet first became the World Wide Web, I was there. I was lucky enough to have a group of people around me that got me online into the world. There was this group of other storytellers that were also getting on, and we all got together. We started this listserv. That's where you send an email out to a certain address, and it goes to all the people in that group. You guys might remember it. None of the kids do today. Listserv is still around, Storytell Listserv, but it's not the same thing anymore because there's so many other ways to connect. But back then, for storytellers, it was the first time we had really come together. Almost every country that had English language storytellers was there represented. It was an incredible, incredible gift for storytellers. And I used those connections to travel around the country, and it was really a wonderful thing. I got to meet hundreds of storytellers, learn hundreds of stories. And one of my very favorite people lived out in the Midwest. Her name was Hope, and she wasn't beautiful. And so she had some issues with her love life. And one day she was complaining about that to me. And I said, you know, not all guys are like that. And she said, oh. And that just inspired me. And I wrote this next story. It's called Chocolate Man. So once there were two brothers, and they were as different as apples and elephants. And when they got older, they were more different still. Now, the first brother, the older brother, he was really good at planning. And I'm not against planning. I plan myself. It's a good idea, but he planned things to death. And mostly what he planned was to make a lot of money. So he made a lot of money, but he didn't have much fun. And the second brother, the younger brother, he was really good at sharing. Some people, mostly his older brother, said he shared more than he should, but he only shared what was his, so that was his business, right? And while he didn't make much money, he had lots of fun. And his lady said to him that he would read aloud to her on lazy Sunday afternoons and by a fire on a cold winter's night. He'd wrap his arms around her, even in public sometimes. Left her alone sometimes too. He did it all. He listened, he spoke, he read, he wrote, he thought, he felt, he smiled, he loved, he was. And one day, when he was leaving his lady friend alone for a little while, someone else did some sharing. And he ended up with a 10-pound chunk of chocolate. And as it was a warm day, he slips that chocolate under his hat and heads for home. Now, there wouldn't be a story if something didn't happen. But what happens kind of hard to believe. You see, he's walking home in the sun. It's getting kind of warm. He's worried about the chocolate. He sees this big old boulder in the shade. Under that big old boulder looked really inviting. So he wanders over and he sits down in the shade of the old boulder and falls asleep. Well, the sun moved. He didn't. Hat didn't move, but the chocolate did. It melted down his face, down the back of his neck, melted down and down till he was covered from head to toe in chocolate. Think he woke up then? Nope. The sun went down, the moon came up, that warm day turned into a cold night, chocolate hardened up. Now he's sitting there like a chocolate Santa Claus. Think he woke up then? Nope. Gets really late. The boulder cracks open. Out comes a family of goblins. And weren't those little goblin children excited to see a chocolate man sitting out in front of their front door? Yeah, goblin mama, she's like, no chocolate till after supper. So they pick up the chocolate man, carry him down into the goblin house, and they leave him while they go off to find some supper. Luckily for that younger brother, the second brother, the goblin house was warm. Chocolate softened up. Pretty soon he was able to jump up and run on home. Wasn't his lady friend glad to see him? She got to eat the chocolate off him. And that's when she found the golden coins. They must have got stuck to him when he was in the goblin house. So now he did have some money. And when the first brother, the older brother, heard about the chocolate and the goblins and the gold, well, he sets the plan in. And since this has to do with him making lots of money, he put it right into effect. Yeah, he goes downtown, buys himself a 10-pound chunk of chocolate, slips it up under his hat, heads over to the big old boulder, sits down in the shade, and he sits there and he's waiting. Sun moved. He didn't. Hat didn't move, but the chocolate did. Melts down his face, down the back of his neck, down and down till he's covered from head to toe in chocolate. Think he moved then? Nope. Too busy thinking about that goblin gold. Well, the sun goes down and the moon comes up. The warm day turns into a cold night. Chocolate hardens up. Now he's sitting there like a chocolate Santa Claus. Think he moves then? Nope. Still thinking about the goblin gold. Gets really late. The boulder cracks open. Out comes the family of goblins. And aren't those little goblin kids excited to see another chocolate man by their front door? This time the goblin mother's like, we ain't letting this one get away. Think he moved then? Nope. Couldn't. The chocolate was too hard. And he was scared stiff. Besides that, the first thing they did was bite off his head. Isn't that what you do to a chocolate Santa Claus? Anyway, the second brother, the younger brother, he lived happily ever after. And his lady said to him that he would read aloud to her on a lazy Sunday afternoon and by a fire on a cold winter's night. That he'd wrap his arms around her, even in public. Left her alone sometimes too. He did it all. He listened, he spoke, he read and he wrote. He thought and he felt and he smiled and he loved and he was. And once in a while, he brought his lady home some chocolate. The chocolate man. I have a favorite story I'd really like to share with you. Some of you might remember James Whitcomb Riley. He was the Hoosier poet over there in Indiana. He was one of my heroes. He wanted to be a poet. He wanted to be a famous poet, and he went out and found Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he shared his poetry with him. And Nathaniel wrote back saying he thought the poetry was wonderful, and he took Nathaniel Hawthorne's letter to all the newspapers and all the magazines and said, "Look, Nathaniel Hawthorne says I'm a great poet," but they wouldn't publish him. But he didn't let that stop him. He started writing more and more, and he took those stories that he wrote, the poems that he wrote, and he took them out into the street, and he would tell them to passerbys. Whenever he saw a group, he shared his poetry until the people started asking for him. And then all the newspapers and magazines wanted to publish his work. and he became known as the Hoosier poet. He wrote in plain, ordinary, everyday language, and he told stories in his poetry. And it was very different than what else was going on. And I'm a little bit of a poet, and I just really admire him. So I learned one of his stories that is probably the most well-known of his tales. It's called Little Orphan Annie. It's not a Valentine story, but it's really wonderful. So I'm going to share that with you now. Little Orphan Annie came to our house to stay, to wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away. She'd shoo the chickens off the porch, dust the hearth and sweep. She'd light the fire and bake the bread and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when the supper things was done, we'd sit around the kitchen fire and have the mostest fun a-listening to the witch tales what Annie tells about. And the goblins is'll get ya if you don't watch out. 'Cause once there was this little boy who never said his prayers, and when he went to bed one night away up the stairs, his mama heard him holler, his daddy heard him bawl. But when they turned the covers down, he wasn't there at all. And they seeked him in the rafter rooms, the cubby holes and press. They seeked him up the chimney flue, everywhere I guess, but all they ever found was his pants turned inside out. And the goblins is'll get ya if you don't watch out. And then there was this other girl, she always laughed and grinned. She was making fun of everyone, all her blood and kin, and once when there was company and old folks was there, she mocked them, and she shocked them, and she said she didn't care. All this as she kicked up her heels and turned to run and hide, but there were two great big black things a-standing by her side, and they snatched her through the ceiling, for she knowed what she's about. And the goblins is'll get ya if you don't watch out. And little Orphan Annie says, when the blaze is blue, and the lamp wick flickers, and the wind goes woo, and you hear the crickets quit, and the moon is gray, and all the lightning bugs and dews all squitched away, you better mind your parents and your teachers fond and dear, and cherish them who loves you. Dry an orphan's tear, and help the poor and needy ones what cluster all about, or the goblins is'll get ya if you don't watch out. Little Orphan Annie,